We sail boldly and follow the winds of truth. We scour the seas of mystery until we find the answers. This is your deep dive. This is Nautical Awakenings.
The Temple of Hathor at Dendera is not simply an ancient structure preserved in stone, nor is it just an archaeological site that reflects the religious beliefs of a long-gone civilization. When examined more deeply, it reveals itself as something far more intricate and psychological. It resembles a mapped system of consciousness, designed for guiding awareness through inner transformation. The architecture mirrors the internal structure of human experience, making it even more compelling. Movement through the temple is a progressive inward journey. It aligns remarkably with the chakra system found in esoteric traditions and yogic philosophy. Moving deeper, the experience shifts from external perception to internal awareness. The inner shrine corresponds to the heart center, Anahata, and the third eye center, Aina, where Hathor's presence is most directly encountered. This is a symbolic convergence point where emotion, intuition, and perception unify. Finally, ascending to the rooftop, exposed to the sky, the symbolism reaches its highest point. Here, the architecture dissolves into open air, mirroring the crown chakra, Sahasrara, representing union with the cosmos itself. The temple becomes a threshold into infinity. When entering Dendera, there is an immediate sense that perception itself begins to reorganize. It does not feel like stepping into a simple building or historical ruin. Instead, it feels like entering a field of intentional design where attention is subtly guided at every moment. Without force or instruction, the architecture seems to know where the human eye will go before the human mind decides it. Corners redirect attention. Columns pull perception upward. Doorways create psychological transitions that feel almost like mental thresholds rather than physical ones. The entire structure behaves as though it is actively participating in the shaping of awareness. In the outer courtyards, the experience is open and expansive. Light spreads freely, sound travels naturally, and the senses remain outward facing. But as one begins to move deeper into the temple, everything begins to change. Light becomes controlled and directional. Sound becomes absorbed, reflected, or amplified depending on where you stand. Even the feeling of space itself begins to shift. In the darker inner halls, perception becomes sharpened. Subtle sounds that would normally go unnoticed suddenly become present and meaningful. A whisper can feel like it carries across the entire chamber. A chant can feel as though it is embedded within the walls themselves, as if the stone is participating in the vibration. These effects are not accidental. They create a gradual recalibration of awareness. It is as if the temple is gently moving the mind from scattered perception into unified attention, from external distraction into internal stillness. For the ancient priesthood, this would not have been interpreted as metaphor. It would have been understood as function. The temple was a form of cognitive architecture, a structured environment designed to influence consciousness directly. Every carving, every inscription, every color choice, and every ritual sound acted as a deliberate input into the human perceptual system. Together, they created a controlled transformation of awareness, guiding the individual away from fragmentation and toward coherence. To understand Dendera today, no, it's not a single moment. It's an accumulation of civilizations, layered over thousands of years. The site's earliest phase dates to Egypt's Old Kingdom, around 2300 BCE under Pepi I. A shrine to Hathor existed, marking its sacred early on. During the Middle Kingdom, Pharaoh Mentuhotep II expanded the site. Though early structures are gone, archaeological traces confirm continuous rebuilding and reinterpretation. The dominant structure today is Greco-Roman. During the Ptolemaic era, construction began on the Grand Temple of Hathor. Ptolemy XII initiated major building work around 54 BC. Cleopatra VII, a final ruler, is linked to the site. She and her son Caesarion appear in reliefs, offering devotion to Hathor. After the Ptolemaic period, Roman rulers continued construction. Emperor Tiberius completed the Great Hypostyle Hall, adding monumental columns and interior halls. By approximately 100 CE, the Temple of Hathor reached its final architectural form. It represents a convergence of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman religious influence. Throughout these transitions, the Hathor cult remained constant. Priestesses and priests served, preserving ritual traditions involving music, dance, chanting, and mythological enactments. Only the ritually purified entered innermost chambers, reinforcing this space as both a spiritual and psychological threshold. The architecture of Dendera is best understood not as a static design, but as a guided sequence of psychological states expressed through space. The journey begins at the massive pylons, which function as symbolic gateways between the external world and the sacred interior. Passing through them feels like leaving one mode of perception and entering another. This represents the most external layer of experience, where perception is still dispersed across the senses. Moving deeper, the first hypostyle hall introduces a forest of columns shaped like papyrus bundles. These columns are not simply structural supports. They create rhythmic patterns of light and shadow that subtly alter spatial awareness. Attention begins to narrow. Focus begins to intensify. Beyond this lies the second hypostyle hall, which becomes darker and more enclosed. At this stage, external distractions begin to fade. The environment becomes more introspective, almost womb-like in its sensory reduction. Next comes the offering hall, where light enters in a highly controlled manner from above. This creates a sense of illumination that is no longer ambient, but directed. It feels almost as though consciousness itself is being spotlighted. Finally, one reaches the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies. This is the innermost chamber of the temple, where the statue of Hathor once resided. The space is quiet, still, and symbolically dense. It represents the point at which external perception dissolves entirely into inner awareness. And above all of this, stairways lead to rooftop shrines, open directly to the sky, where the boundary between structure and cosmos disappears completely. Each transition is not only architectural, it is experiential, it is psychological, it is perceptual. Modern acoustic studies confirm that each chamber produces distinct resonance patterns, meaning that sound behaves differently depending on where one stands. Some areas amplify deep frequencies, while others sustain echo or create near silence that feels almost physically present. In this way, the temple does not merely contain sound. It shapes it, and in doing so, it shapes the mind that experiences it. Hathor is often described as a goddess, yet within the temple's symbolic structure, she functions as a principle of harmonic intelligence. This intelligence is expressed through mythological form. She is associated with music, joy, emotional balance, and cosmic nurturing. Her imagery, particularly the sun disk held between cow horns, represents the integration of duality. This creates a unified field of awareness. At Dendera, ritual sound played a central role in expressing this principle. Instruments like the sistrum were used not simply for ceremony. They altered the state of awareness within the temple environment. Chanting, rhythm, and vibration were used to stabilize attention and synchronize group consciousness. Sound in this context was not entertainment, it was alignment. It was a method of tuning perception to a specific frequency of experience. Hathor therefore represents what might be called a state of coherence, where emotional, perceptual, and cognitive processes are no longer fragmented, but harmonized into a single unified field of awareness. Within Egyptian cosmology, time is not linear. It doesn't move in a straight path. Instead, time moves in cycles, constantly returning, repeating, and transforming through recurrence. The Temple of Dendera reflects this worldview, aligned with solar cycles, stellar motion, and seasonal rhythms. The Dendera zodiac visually represents this cosmic order, mapping time as a circular system, not linear progression. Rituals within the temple synchronize with these cycles, solar risings and seasonal flooding. Celestial alignments were not just observed, but reenacted through profound ceremony. This repetition had a profound psychological effect. Perception of time itself begins to shift. Moments feel more expansive. Identity feels less fixed. Awareness becomes more fluid. Across cultures, the serpent often represents this cyclical understanding of time, particularly the uraeus cobra, always shown coiled, not extended. This coil represents time not as a straight line, but as a spiral of continuous transformation, a timeless journey through ancient wisdom. The serpent appears across nearly every ancient spiritual tradition, including Egyptian, Indian, Greek, and Gnostic systems. Its persistence suggests that it represents something fundamental about human consciousness itself. At Dendera, serpentine imagery is woven throughout the temple design, appearing in crowns, carvings, and symbolic representations of divine forces. The serpent is not random decoration, it is a coded metaphor for transformation. Unlike linear movement, the serpent moves through coils and spirals. This reflects the actual structure of human psychological growth, which rarely progresses in a straight line. Instead, growth occurs through cycles of repetition, return, resistance, and refinement. In Indian tradition, this process is described as Kundalini, a coiled energy that rises through the spine in stages of awakening. Each stage represents a deeper integration of awareness. Psychologically, this mirrors how human beings evolve through repeated encounters with the same patterns of experience, each time at a higher level of understanding. The serpent therefore represents not chaos, but structured evolution. The chakra system describes consciousness as an ascending structure of 7 primary energy centers located along the spine. Each chakra corresponds not only to an energetic concept, but to a psychological stage of development. The root chakra governs survival and grounding, the sacral chakra governs emotion and creativity. The solar plexus governs identity and personal power. The heart chakra governs connection and unity. The throat chakra governs expression and truth. The third eye governs perception and intuition. And the crown chakra represents pure awareness beyond form. In yogic tradition, these centers are interconnected by subtle energy channels known as Ida, Pingala, and Sushumna. When Kundalini energy rises through these channels, it activates each center sequentially, producing experiences of expanded awareness, emotional release, and heightened perception. When mapped onto Dendera, the temple becomes a physical representation of this inner system, transforming architecture into a mirror of human consciousness. When all these layers are brought together, something emerges beyond symbolic interpretation. The temple reveals itself as a unified system of consciousness expressed through physical space. The temple becomes an externalized structure of the mind, where inner psychological processes translate into spatial progression. Movement through stone architecture mirrors movement through internal states of awareness. The outer courtyard corresponds to the most external layer of human experience, consciousness directed outward. As one moves inward, the environment gradually reduces sensory complexity, altering attention distribution. This reduction shifts awareness away from fragmentation and toward coherence. The inner halls reflect this transition, as perception becomes increasingly focused and internalized. Emotional processing begins to surface more strongly, and the mind is no longer oriented toward external distraction. The central chambers represent a deeper stage of transformation, where identity stabilizes and concentrates. Personal will, emotional memory, and self-awareness interact in a more intensified and refined way. Finally, the sanctuary represents the most inward collapse of perception, external sensory input minimized. Awareness begins to fold inward upon itself, creating conditions for intuitive perception or direct inner knowing. Thought and sensation become less distinct, and awareness becomes more unified. Above all, the rooftop chambers open the structure entirely to the sky, dissolving boundaries, symbolically representing the expansion of awareness beyond individual identity into a broader field of unified existence. When viewed through this framework, the temple is no longer simply a metaphor for consciousness. It functions like a mechanism that actively guides attention through controlled stages of perceptual refinement. A deeper principle, ancient sacred architecture across many civilizations operates on a shared logic. Consciousness can be shaped through environment. Structuring space in specific ways structures the experience of awareness itself. Initiation was not just a symbolic story through ritual, but a direct manipulation of perception through sensory design. Architecture, sound, light, and movement work together as a unified system to progressively reorganize the mind. Sound plays a crucial role. Enclosed stone environments create resonance fields where vibration behaves predictably. Within spaces like the hypostyle halls, sound does not simply travel in a linear direction. Instead, it reflects, overlaps, and lingers, altering perception of time and presence. A chant in such a space is no longer experienced as a single momentary sound, but as a continuing field of vibration that surrounds the listener. This draws attention inward while simultaneously expanding sensory awareness outward, creating a paradoxical state where focus and diffusion occur at the same time. From a modern perspective, this can be understood through how the human brain entrains to rhythmic stimuli. Repeated sound patterns influence neural oscillations and guide the nervous system into states of meditation. absorption, and altered awareness. But within the temple context, this was not understood as neuroscience. It was understood as alignment, where sound becomes a tool for tuning consciousness into harmony with the structure of reality itself. The figure of Hathor becomes especially important. She's not just a mythological character within a religious system, but a symbolic expression of consciousness fully integrated. A state of profound inner harmony, Hathor signifies the resolution of internal fragmentation. Perception, emotion, and awareness cease to conflict. They synchronize into a single, coherent field of experience, a unified state of being. This is why she's linked to music, joy, beauty, and nourishment. In ancient symbolism, these aren't just emotions, but indicators of alignment, a state where perception is no longer distorted by inner division. Beauty isn't decorative, and music isn't entertainment. Both function as perceptual signatures of harmony, where reality is experienced without resistance, distortion, or internal contradiction. Hathor therefore becomes the experiential outcome of the entire temple system itself. The point where the structure of space, sound, ritual, and symbolism all converge into a single unified state of consciousness. She is not something you worship at the end of the path. She is what the path produces when awareness becomes fully aligned. As this process continues through the temple, another layer becomes visible, the structure of cyclical time itself. Unlike modern linear conceptions of time, the ancient Egyptian worldview operated through repetition, return, and cosmic cycles. Reality is not moving away from itself, but constantly looping through transformation. This is why solar movement, seasonal flooding, and stellar cycles were not just observed, but ritually reenacted, because repetition was understood as a way of synchronizing human awareness with the underlying structure of reality. Within this system, the serpent becomes the most precise symbolic expression of this principle. Unlike a straight line, the serpent moves through coils and spirals, representing transformation that returns to itself while simultaneously evolving. The uraeus cobra, always shown coiled, is a direct visual expression of time as recursion rather than progression, and across multiple traditions, this same symbolic structure reappears. In Indian systems, it is called Kundalini, the coiled force of awareness rising through the spine. In Gnostic traditions, it appears as the Ouroboros, the serpent consuming its own tail, representing eternal renewal, and in Greek symbolism, it appears in healing staffs, associated with transformation and restoration. What this suggests is not cultural coincidence, but a shared recognition of a deeper experiential pattern, where consciousness itself does not evolve in straight lines, but through cycles of return, integration, and expansion. When this framework is applied to the chakra system, the temple begins to function as a physical analogy of inner anatomy. Each architectural zone corresponds not only to symbolic meaning, but to progressive states of psychological development. The outer zones correspond to survival and grounding, where awareness is primarily concerned with physical existence. The inner halls correspond to emotional and relational processing, where identity begins to form through interaction and experience. The deeper chambers correspond to personal power and inner transformation, where the self becomes more defined and internally structured. The sanctuary corresponds to intuitive perception and inner stillness, where awareness begins to detach from external identification, and the rooftop corresponds to transcendence, where perception expands beyond individuality and into a more unified field of awareness. In this way, movement through the temple becomes indistinguishable from movement through consciousness itself. And when all of these layers are brought together, historical, symbolic, psychological, physiological, and neurological, a final synthesis begins to emerge that completely recontextualizes what the Temple of Hathor actually is. It is not simply representing consciousness through symbolism. It is actively modeling consciousness through structure. And more than that, it appears to demonstrate a principle that runs through many ancient traditions, which is that consciousness is not separate from the environments that shape it, but is instead continuously formed through interaction with structure, space, and perception itself. This is why the serpent, sound, architecture, and myth are not isolated symbols within the system, but interconnected functions within a single coherent design. The serpent represents transformation as cyclical movement rather than linear progression. Sound represents activation of awareness through vibration and resonance. Architecture represents the guided structuring of attention through space. And Hathor represents the emergent state of coherence that arises when all of these systems are aligned. But even at this stage, the deeper implication is not that the temple contains meaning. It is that meaning itself emerges through the relationship between awareness and structure. which means the temple is not separate from the observer of it. It is part of the same cognitive field that is interpreting it. And as this realization stabilizes, the boundary between inner and outer experience begins to soften, because what was once perceived as external architecture begins to reveal itself as an extension of perception itself. In the final unfolding of this understanding, even the idea of a journey begins to dissolve, because what the temple ultimately reveals is not a path from ignorance to knowledge or from separation to unity, but rather a gradual recognition of something that was present at every stage of the experience. The temple was never only a structure moving you from one space to another. It was a mirror reflecting the movement of awareness through itself, and when that reflection becomes fully clear, the distinction between observer and environment can no longer be sustained in the same way, because both are revealed to be expressions of a single continuous field of consciousness. What you thought you were walking through was never separate from what was doing the walking. What you thought you were observing was never separate from the awareness doing the observing. And what you thought was a temple in space was always already a structure in awareness. In that final recognition, there is nothing left to reach, nothing left to decode, and nothing left to arrive at, because the entire system resolves into a single, quiet understanding that the temple was never outside of you, and you were never outside of it. There was only awareness, appearing as both, and recognizing itself through the form of everything it perceived.
I'ma kill you. Niggas coming at you with supersonic speed. Summon, I'm a demon, you assuming I'm a human. What I gotta do to get it through to you? I'm superhuman, innovative, and I made a promise of anything you say is niggas singing over me and the world. You're devastating, more than ever demonstrating how to give a motherfucker no to get to feel like it's levitating, never fading. And I know the haters are forever waiting for the day that they can say I fell off to be celebrating. Cause I know the way to get it motivated. I make elevating music, you make elevator music. But with the key and the secret to grab your talents, yeah, like I have. All of it's true for the blueprints, secret page and youthful exuberance. Everybody loves to run from a nuisance. Hit the earth like an asteroid, ain't nothing but shit for the moon since. MCs get taken